we're very pleased with this turnout on a very, very short notice for this discussion panel. First, welcome to IPFW's Honors Program, Honors Center. My name is Farah Combs. I'm the director of the Honors Program here, and I would like to thank all of you for coming, as well as College TV and WBOI for broadcasting this discussion panel of President Trump's executive order on refugees and immigrants. And also, we don't want to forget to thank Dr. Andy Downs for helping us coordinate these broadcasts as well. Today's panel is co-sponsored by the Department of Political Science and the Peace and Conflict Studies program at IPFW. We welcome IPFW students and the community members here today. And today's topic is very controversial, so especially in this time. And our panelists today, let's introduce them. First, we have Dr. Jamie Toole, Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of Major Scholarship. Next to his right, we have Dr. Michael Wolf, Professor and Chair of the Department of Political Science. To his right, we have Professor Georgia Ralsand Altschneider, Associate Professor of Political Science and IPFW Campus Pre-Law Advisor. And to her right, we have Professor James Lutz, Professor of Political Science, who has co-authored multiple books and dozens of journal articles on the dynamics of terrorism. So first, we will start with you, Mike. If you can explain to us what are the executive orders, what do they mean, and why presidents have this power, what are the limits of these executive orders?
Thanks. So executive orders are a necessary part of the American political system to begin with. We tend to think of them as maybe too much power seated in one person's hands, but they nevertheless are fundamental for the ability of the executive branch to execute law the way it's needed to do, right? It's an administrative necessity. And if we tend to be critical of it because no one wants power too centralized, but we also have this U.S. Congress thing that doesn't often write legislation, partially due to design by our friend James Madison, to not necessarily be clear, but to have consensus building legislation that doesn't have details necessarily built in, or that details aren't dynamic. So we need executive orders to give specificity of how to administrate. That said, what we've seen over the last 40 years with the increased party polarization and gridlock in Congress is that presidents, as they always have taken particularly the opportunity to put much more policy stamps on us. This is not new. If we look back, Franklin Roosevelt certainly took advantage of this. So did Johnson and others who had big advantages in Congress. They still wanted to put their own kind of stamp on things. So these are not new, and they're very consequential throughout American history, including the internment of Japanese American citizens that was backed up by the Supreme Court. But we've also seen that the checks on executive orders have diminished in some way. In the 1980s, a big Supreme Court case, wasn't seen to be big at the time, set a precedent that Congress, who used to, with a small scale, undo executive orders, was prohibited from doing what was called a legislative veto by telling the president, you can't do this, because it was seen to cross into the executive function of the presidency in Chadha decision, if I'm not mistaken, on an immigration case, ironically. So this has led presidents to not be checked by Congress and be checked by only the federal courts, really, to be able to say something is unconstitutionally administrated. The key here, kind of to understand then, is that presidents didn't take long to figure out that this is it. And it's not to say that frequency of these executive orders has increased, but certainly some of the political ramifications of these and symbolism that we see have increased in recent times. And I know Jamie wanted to talk about some of the nature of this particular executive order.
Right. So let's briefly go through the main provisions of the executive order that we're talking about today. For those of you in the room or watching on TV, we have slides. For those of you listening, I will be clear about what is on the slides. First, we have main provisions of this executive order. First provision is that for 90 days, it suspends the entry of aliens from 7 countries: Iran, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Sudan, Somalia, and Yemen. That's for 90 days. For 120 days, it suspends the U.S. refugee admissions program, so suspending admissions of refugees for 120 days. Additionally, it suspends entry of all Syrian refugees for an indefinite length of time. So Syrian refugees don't come under the 120-day suspension that's suspended indefinitely at the moment. Those are the three sort of headline provisions of the order. There are two other important main provisions. First, it sets the overall refugee admission limit for the United States for the year 2017 at 50,000 people. That's 50,000 from all countries. And the other main provision of the order is that when refugee admissions do resume after the 120-day suspension, the order prioritizes claims made by members of religious minorities who can demonstrate religious persecution. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in more detail later on, so I won't get into any details. But those are the main features of the order. Continuing on, we have some additional features of the order. First, these suspension periods, the 90 days and the 120 days, are used to report on current procedures and standards used by the U.S. government and by governments sending people our way from abroad. And during that period, so the U.S. government relevant agencies are supposed to recommend any changes to those current procedures and standards. Second additional feature of the order is that entry can resume conditional upon the strengthening of procedures in the sending countries. So this is a really important provision. So after 90 days, in the case of people coming in from those 7 countries, or after 120 days, in the case of refugees, it's not automatic that everybody's just going to start coming in again. Entry is conditional upon the sending states sort of revising and strengthening their procedures. And I think if we look at the list of sending states, I think we can conclude that the likelihood of at least some of these states strengthening their procedures to the satisfaction of the U.S. President is very low. As we know, Syria, Libya, and Yemen are all undergoing civil war at this moment. Somalia has a barely functioning government that can barely control most of the capital city, Mogadishu, and that's only with the help of African Union peacekeeping troops. So I think we can assume that even after these suspension periods expire, entry will resume only from some countries. A third additional feature of the order is that throughout the suspension period, individuals may be admitted on a case-by-case basis when it's deemed to be in the national interest. So for all these countries, there is the provision to allow individual people in on a case-by-case basis. And there was initial controversy because, for example, Iraqi translators who had supported U.S. forces were caught in this order, and presumably some of those at least would be allowed in on a case-by-case basis. So those are the main additional features of the order. I listed one other sort of catch-all feature, but I think I won't go into that now. Very briefly, we'll also summarize the major trends in U.S. immigration policy and a few major features of international refugee law. In U.S. immigration policy, before 1924, many categories of people were simply barred from entering the U.S., and these bars were in most cases, very explicitly racist. And it wasn't until 1965, with the Immigration and Nationality Act, that discrimination against immigrants due to race, sex, nationality, place of birth, or place of residence was outlawed. So 1965 marks a very important change. It's a product of its time because that, of course, was at the height of the U.S. civil rights movement. So it makes sense that there'd be strong focus on ending discrimination. However, there was also an act passed in 1952, and we may talk about that in a few minutes, that allows the president to suspend entry of, quote, any class of aliens, end quote, detrimental to U.S. interests. This also was a product of its time, coming during the Cold War, during the McCarthy period, during the Red Scare period. And so there's a tension between the 1952 Act and the 1965 Act, 1965 being very open, 1952 allowing some restrictions and bans, and we may talk about the details there. Finally, international refugee policy, which is generally similar to U.S. refugee policy, or at least as it's been in the past, maybe two very important things. One, a refugee is a special category of migrant. So refugee is not just anyone who wants to get into a country. It only includes people with a well-founded fear of persecution. And those are the key legal words in international law and domestic law. A well-founded fear of persecution upon being sent home. And that persecution can be because of his or her race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. And so if a person can demonstrate a well-founded fear of persecution on any of those bases, generally speaking, a country is required to admit that person, particularly if that person is coming directly from the country that is causing him or her harm. And so a refugee is different from a general migrant. A migrant is a larger category of people. Migrants move from one country to another for a variety of reasons, sometimes for economic gain, for a better life, and maybe also for a well-funded fear of persecution. Only those migrants who have a well-funded fear of persecution and can demonstrate that is someone who is a refugee. Finally, I said finally. Now I'm really meaning finally. We have 3 slides that I'm not going to read, but I'm just going to scroll through them. This shows the current refugee vetting process in the United States. That's before any changes by President Trump. And as we look through here, we see a list of 20 different steps that are taken in vetting refugees. And I think it's very fair to say that the refugee vetting process has been incredibly rigorous, regardless of what you might have heard in the presidential campaign. There's no way I think this could be interpreted as anything but incredibly rigorous, and this dates back a number of years. Some of these steps that we've shown in these slides are additional steps for Syrian refugees. The Syrian refugee vetting process is the strictest of all, and it's incredibly hard to come into this country as a refugee, and once you're in, you've been vetted up and down as thoroughly as humanly possible.
Thank you, Jamie. Georgia, this question is for you. Many critics have said that this executive order is either or both unlawful and unconstitutional because, 1, it goes beyond the limits of executive orders, or 2, establishes a Muslim ban, or what some people would call a Muslim ban, that would be considered unconstitutional. What are the constitutional and legal ramifications of this executive order?
They really fall in 2 categories, either by statute or by constitutional argument. And Professor Toole talked about a couple of the statutes, but essentially President Trump relied on a particular statute and a particular constitutional theory and constitutional case. The statute he relied on was the 1952 McCarran-Walter Act, in which it says the president has a right to suspend a class of aliens that he or she finds detrimental to the interest of the United States. And that's part of the basis of the executive order. The second and complementary basis comes out of an argument that Congress, along with the president, has what is called plenary power to control admissions. And the only Supreme Court case that deals with plenary power is a very old case. It's actually from 1889, which is well before this 1952 Act. But there was a Chinese Exclusion Act at the end of the 1880s. And the Supreme Court said that, again, Congress with the president have the plenary power to exclude in this case. Now, a lot has happened since then, which has to do with the critics of this executive order. Professor Toole mentioned, of course, the 1965 Immigration and Nationalization Act that barred discrimination against immigrants on the basis of race, sex, nationality, place of birth, or place of residence. And the argument is that this, in a sense, amends the 1952 McCarran-Walter Act. In addition to that, in 1980, there is also a Refugee Act. There is an amendment to this 1965 Act, Immigration Act, that says in providing services for refugees, you cannot discriminate on the basis, among other things, of nationality or religion. And so the theory is that those 2 acts are implanted on top of McCarran-Walter and amended in that regard. As far as plenary power goes, there are a couple things. This case that I cited from way back when is a case that was decided at approximately the same time as Plessy versus Ferguson, which sounds like, why am I talking about Plessy versus Ferguson that involves race discrimination and separate but equal? It was decided by the same set of justices. And the theory of what equal protection means and equality means and when government can or cannot discriminate was altered, of course, by Brown versus the Board of Education. So there's a real question if this 1889 case is even constitutional or not involving plenary power. That in fact, what happens, and this is what critics charge, that this involves discrimination, unconstitutional discrimination under the Equal Protection Clause. In addition to that, there's the question of whether it also violates the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. It's well settled that all justices of the left and right in the last 20 years on the court agree that if the Establishment Clause means anything, it means that government can't favor one religion or sect over another religion or sect. So justices like Anton Scalia, Clarence Thomas, agree with justices like Sonia Sotomayor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg on no preference. And the argument is that, of course, at least part of this violates the Establishment Clause as well. So that's the battle.
So to look at it from a different angle, Professor Jim Lutz, as a renowned terrorism expert, do you think this executive order will reduce the threat of terrorism against the United States, both internationally and in the homeland as well? And how will it affect the fight against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria?
Thank you. The short answer is it will probably hurt more than it helps. And some of the reasons for that is that, going back to Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, he couched the 9/11 attack and other activities as a battle between Islam and the West and as a defense of Islam against the West. And this executive order provides a huge propaganda tool for al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other groups to demonstrate that the West is anti-Muslim. And President Bush Jr., after 9/11, went at great lengths to indicate that the United States was at war with terrorism, not with Islam. President Obama followed up with another 8 years of reinforcing that. And this executive order undercuts those efforts in a variety of ways because it does play into the idea of the clash of civilizations, which was something Samuel Huntington came up with, but something bin Laden also referred to in his own writings and as seeking to create such a clash of civilizations as a way of mobilizing Islam against the West. It also is going to create difficulties because in today's world with the internet and propaganda, it's going to be a boon to recruitment for groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda and other groups, both in the Middle East and African countries with Muslim populations where individuals are much more likely to join those groups to engage in terrorist and guerrilla activities against their governments and against U.S. interests. And even if this executive order were to limit attacks in the United States, it's probably going to increase attacks against American interests abroad. And long before 9/11, there were very few attacks on U.S. soil, but there were lots of attacks against U.S. interests abroad. And now, basically, it creates a target for American tourists, for American students, for American businessmen, for American corporations. Any activities involving the United States are now increasingly likely to be targets. I think it also, as a propaganda tool, will increase recruitment via the internet for lone wolf attacks, as they're called, inside the United States from not refugees, maybe from green card holders, maybe from U.S. citizens, maybe from converts to Islam, who have been some of the attacks already, all of whom are U.S. citizens and legal residents, against a variety of U.S. targets, as has occurred in the past. And this is a way of, I mean, the internet arguments, the propaganda has suggested that the United States is anti-Islamic, and this executive order falls into the trap of reinforcing that propaganda. And even with qualifications and changes that occur, the damage is already done, and it's going to be very difficult to undo it. In terms of how it will affect the fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, generally it will hurt. We've already seen problems that an Iraqi, I think 4-star general, going from the color, who was going to come here to visit his family, was prohibited, is prohibited from visiting his family. He's cooperated with the United States. He's in charge of the elite Iraqi counterterrorism forces, and he can't come visit his family because there's a ban on travel from Iraq for Iraqi citizens. That does not engender good relations with a potential ally. Also, the United States and Iran are in the same side in the battle against ISIS. Iran is supporting the Iraqi government against ISIS. They have military advisors there, and I rather suspect they have a number of volunteers in uniform fighting alongside the Iraqi forces. And so we're on the same page in regard to ISIS for different reasons, admittedly, but we're allies of convenience. Yet the executive order also bans migrants from Iran, which is not a country in turmoil, which is relatively stable, which has not been a source of much in the way of terrorist violence elsewhere in the world, unlike Somalia and Libya and Syria and Iraq. And this was clearly another way of the new administration indicating to Iran that antagonistic relations are back at the same time that we're supposed to be fighting together against ISIS in Iraq. That is an additional weakness in terms of being able to fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and will probably be counterproductive. It is not going to accomplish, I do not believe it will accomplish what the president and his advisors think it will accomplish in regards to the fight in terrorism. It will, in all likelihood, make things worse rather than better.
Thank you, Jim. Jamie, in your opinion, how will this affect America's place in the international order? The U.S. has engaged Iran in a nuclear deal and works closely with the Iraqis in the fight against the Islamic State. How will this affect America's ability to work with other nations?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would underscore is that, of course, our national security is important, right? I agree, of course, with what Professor Lutz has said. There, of course, are many people out there who think that this is a really great executive order and that this is a way that we can strengthen national security. I think Professor Lutz indicated some very good specific ways in which, very convincing specific ways in which this will not help all that much. I think it's worth noting that a lot of people agree that this was a poorly structured executive order, even if perhaps the gist of it is what a lot of Americans want. There's been plenty of criticism from even important conservative news outlets. The Wall Street Journal had an editorial very much against the way this was structured and implemented. The National Review has had that too, and other conservative sources have. It's worth noting that, I think maybe Jim mentioned this already, I'm not sure, but that the 7 countries listed in the 90-day suspension, citizens from those countries are responsible for, I think, none or virtually no terrorist attacks in the U.S. since September 11th. It's worth noting that countries that really have sent people, not sent, but from whom people who've committed terrorist acts have come, countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, both of whose citizens were involved in the September 11th attacks, they're not on the list. Nor are other countries, if the rationale here was to suspend entry of people from countries that have, some kind of strong terrorist presence, you would think maybe France or Belgium or other Western allies would be on the list, and they're not. So there are obviously some real problems here, even if you do think that national security is important. In terms, and I think most people do agree that national security is important. In terms of the U.S. place in the international order, let me make a few brief points. First of all, this is an example of protectionism as opposed to globalization, right? We normally think of protectionism as an economic thing, cutting off trade, reducing trade, et cetera. And of course, that's another pillar of Donald Trump's international policy proposals. But this really is, one more way to sort of close off the country to outside influences. What effects are this, will this have? There are going to be some very specific effects. I'm guessing a lot of countries are going to reimpose visa requirements on Americans, make it harder for us to travel elsewhere. That may seem like a minor inconvenience, but these things tend to sort of pick up steam and expand. It may just be harder for people to move around the world in coming months and years. It also, of course, creates an increased atmosphere of tension and conflict. We saw just this morning, of course, Donald Trump getting into a spat with the Prime Minister of Australia over immigrant admissions. So here we're even arguing with some of our closest allies in the world about this. So these are things that at least in minor ways, but perhaps growing ways, challenge international stability. Which leads me to my second and even broader point, that this also represents, this is one element of a package of President Trump's international proposals that challenges the international order, the international system, the international web of relationships that countries have with one another through trade and diplomatic engagement, that countries have through international organizations and international law. This entire international system that was put in place after World War II, from 1945 onward, and for these past 75 years or so, have largely been viewed as very, very important in maintaining global stability and in preventing war, or at least reducing the incidence of war. And so the threats to this international stable order that was created after 1945, I think, are very real, and this is one of the steps leading to further challenge. I would point out too that web of international relationships was very much set up by the United States. That effort was led by the United States after 1945, and has long been viewed as being very much in U.S. national security and economic self-interest. And the third thing I would say about this is that the order threatens U.S. interests in specific countries as well. It puts pressure on some of our allies who are struggling under tremendous refugee burdens. This country doesn't have any tremendous refugee burdens. We have refugees are a very, very tiny percentage of the American population. But we have some very important allies in the world who are straining under very large refugee burdens, countries like Jordan and Turkey bordering Syria. Iraq, which we normally, of course, don't think is a very stable country, is actually home to a lot of refugees from Syria. They fled Syria to go to Iraq, which tells you something, of course, about the situation in Syria. And the other way, another important way in which it threatens U.S. interests in specific countries is that, of course, it's very likely to create a backlash in Muslim-majority countries against the United States, at least from the perception, if not the reality, that this is a Muslim ban, or at least part of a Muslim ban. Which actually leads me to a question that I would ask you, Pharaoh, which is, I wonder if you can tell us anything about sort of reactions in the popular press, in the Arab popular press, or in Muslim-majority countries, anything you've read or encountered, reaction to the order.
The thing is, in the Arab world, there are a lot of problems that America is the last thing that they're going to be looking at, considering the situation in the Arab world right now. And like you mentioned, in Syria, in Iraq, they have more problems that they have to more important problems that they have to worry about than who is the president of the United States. But having said that, in some of the press, if you read over some of the newspapers in the Gulf states, in Syria as well, they will mention, there's a common statement that is mentioned in the papers where there is a mental instability with Trump. There's like more of making fun than more of the serious talk, as well as they always bring up that he lacks experience, political experience. He is ruled by arrogance. He is racist. He is more biased towards, and I have to mention this more to the. Maybe I should not. I'll put this aside. Maybe after the cameras are turned off or something, I'll mention this. But then you will see some writers, and this is again. This is not what the countries, this does not represent what the countries are saying. This is more to the writer's opinion. There's a huge difference. So because most Arab countries, especially in the Gulf states, they want to keep good relations with America. I mean, the first one to congratulate, I believe, the first Arab president to congratulate Trump on his presidency was Sisi. Am I correct? I don't know. You might know more than I do. Is that correct? And of course, in some of the Arab media, you will find people that kind of made fun of him. That, oh, look at him. He's trying to basically be more of a traitor to the Arabs and closer to the West, which in the Arab opinion, that is not a very positive thing. But many of them went and congratulated Trump on his presidency. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, it does. It does.
So.
And, I mean, not surprising. Of course, you know, it's diplomatic courtesy
Yes.
to compliment presidents on election victories, and it's also very much in one's self-interest to compliment the president of the strongest country on the face of the earth, whether or not you agree with them.
And that's one of the things also that you see in common with the different writers, that he lacks diplomacy. So just because you just mentioned that. So I will ask you, Jim, a question. And what does it mean to you, or what does it mean, in your opinion, that the Gulf states, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt were left out of this ban, despite the fact that these countries currently house millions of Syrian refugees? And I will just, yes, go ahead.
Well, in the case of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, since they have oil, and although the United States is more energy sufficient than it used to be, the petroleum is important to our allies in Europe and Japan. So the continued flow of petroleum is important to the Western alliances. At a general level, it's not clear that President Trump has as much concern about that as previous presidents have. But that is one issue that comes into play, and the stability, their stability for the global economic system is important. Egypt is important as a stabilizing force, at least under President Sisi in the Middle East. It's a country which can at least talk to Israel on behalf of the Palestinians and be something of a neutral go-between and be helpful in that regard. These are countries, Jordan and Lebanon have been pro-Western, so these are countries at one level that have had good relations with the United States, are perhaps less threatening in some respects, but also, I think as a number of people pointed out, these are also countries, Saudi Arabia in particular and Egypt, where President Trump, through his business practices, has had business relationships with in the past, and I'm not going to suggest that because he has business relationships with these countries, he's not going to put them on the ban, but I think he didn't put them on the ban because he's more familiar with them, and he may lack diplomatic experience and government experience, but he at least has some knowledge of countries where he's interacted with, and therefore they seem less threatening to him. And also, unlike Somalia and Libya and Syria and Iraq and Yemen, all of which are countries in turmoil, these are countries that are reasonably stable. Now, as I mentioned before, so is Iran, but Iran was put on that list for a completely different set of reasons that really have nothing whatsoever to do with refugees being a threat, because ISIS and Al-Qaeda are threats to Shia Muslims just as they are to Westerners. But this is a group of countries that are less threatening and also that have been involved at some level on the U.S. side, such as it is in Iraq and in Syria and fighting ISIS. The executive order, of course, makes life much more difficult for them as well, as it does these recruitment in the Middle East for actions against these countries which have had dissidents involved in terrorism is now going to be easier because they are also going to suffer. It's not just U.S. interest abroad, but it's recruitment to local groups that are opposed to governments in the Middle East that are seen as either being oppressive or linked to the West. And the monarchies qualify, as does Egypt and Jordan, and even potentially Lebanon, which depends on, that one is not quite as clear.
right, thank you, Jim. Georgia, what is the next step for this constitutionally and through the courts? Many states' attorneys general and tech companies are fighting this executive order. These challenges center on either the Establishment Clause or questions over equal protection. Can you explain the constitutional issues related to each of these?
I talked a little bit about, of course, equal protection and discrimination, and a little bit about the establishment. I think the big question is what's next. I'm sure many of you saw that when this executive order was first in place, there were a number of federal district courts. That's the lowest level of court, national court, issued temporary injunctions, etc., related to this executive order, vis-a-vis the people that were in detention in, for instance, Dulles, in JFK, etc. And all of those district courts essentially, for the most part, ordered that the people that had been detained removed from detention. But those were very narrow orders. Those were based just upon the few people in detention under arguments of due process, that they did not receive adequate notice, things like that. They were not the larger issues about discrimination, the larger issues about violation of the Establishment Clause. 2 days ago, there was an order that emanated out of the Federal District Court in Los Angeles. Again, the lowest national court at the national level. That was a little bit more extensive. That order placed a temporary bar to Trump's executive order on the notion that there is discrimination based on nationality. Now, arguably, that federal district court order only applies to the area, the jurisdiction of that district court. But it's the first one in which you see kind of a little wider decision. And for those critics of President Trump's executive order, they were heartened by that. You're seeing multiple battles over this, which means that you could very well see, after the federal district level, any appeals that are made will go up to the United States Courts of Appeal. And you may see, it's hard to tell, you may see slight differences in circuit in terms of the outcome. And that is the perfect situation for a case to go to the United States Supreme Court. I should say another thing. This case is not perfectly analogous in the sense that it doesn't involve an executive order. But for our circuit, we are in the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, Fort Wayne is, out of Chicago. And there's a recent analogous argument that relates to refugees, issues of discrimination on the basis of nationality, etc. And some of you may have heard of it. Remember I mentioned that Refugee Act of 1980? Okay, that kind of amended the 1965 Act. That Refugee Act, part of that act is to ensure that there are resettlement funds that flow from the federal government to the states for the purpose of helping the states resettle refugees. And resettlement funds were going to go to the state of Indiana. Then Governor Pence, by order at the state level, essentially barred Syrian refugees coming to Indiana from those resettlement funds, but not other refugees coming to Indiana. That case went up to the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the court just below the Supreme Court in our area. In October of this year, there was a unanimous decision by 2 Reagan appointees, Justice Posner and Justice Easterbrook, and Diane Sykes, who was on the list of 27 judges that President Trump was considering for a Supreme Court nomination. And unanimously, they struck down Pence's policy. He had argued that he didn't want the funds to go to Syrian refugees because he was worried about security in the state of Indiana, and it wasn't a ban on nationality, it was based on security. Justice Posner wrote the decision. He's probably considered one of the most influential judges at the circuit court level. Posner said it is clearly a ban based on national origin. It violates this Refugee Act that has the ban on national origin, but that implicates equal protection as well. It'll be interesting. This case, obviously, these cases would not percolate up to the Supreme Court until clearly we'll see if President Trump's new appointment, Neil Gorsuch, is confirmed, if he is confirmed by the Senate. And that could be quite a battle. The earliest he will ever get confirmed and seated on the court will be April. April is the last cases they hear this year. So I don't think you'd ever see this case get to the Supreme Court level, any of them, until next year. So it's going to be quite a battle.
Well, thank you, Georgia. Any last comments from our panelists before we open it for Q&A? No? Well, thank you to our panelists. Any questions? Go ahead, Cody.
I have a question for Dr. Lutz. How would this affect recruitment for Boko Haram in Nigeria?
I don't think it'll have a major impact because Boko Haram is operating mostly on local issues. There'll be a little bit of spillover in that it does strengthen their propaganda and their opposition to the West and Western civilization. Western civilization is forbidden, is the usual translation. And of course, the United States is linked to the West. So it's an additional argument. But Boko Haram basically operates on the local issues and has a lot to do with the Nigerian government. It clearly will not hurt them, and it will have some positive benefit, but I don't think it will be a huge one.
I got a question. I guess this would probably go towards Jamie. News yesterday was that there was about 900 members, these are career people of the State Department, that issued a letter protesting Donald Trump's immigration restrictions. And then Trump basically said, if you don't want to enforce what I want, then leave. And from my understanding, about 900 people have left the State Department. These are people who are career State Department employees, people that know folks around the world on the ground. Now they're not there. So the State Department is going to be getting about 1,000 new people to be running the show. How is that going to impact our ability to do foreign policy overall? Like, what is the impact of losing these career people? Who could maybe help? Is that you, Jamie?
Yeah, thanks. So, so the question concerned the roughly 1,000 U.S. State Department employees who've signed a dissenting cable at the U.S. State Department. And in the question, you mentioned that they were no longer with the State Department. I don't think that's the case. What they've done is they've registered their dissent. There have been a few high-profile people who have left at the top levels of state or were forced out by President Trump, but these are State Department employees. So here's how this works. The dissent channel was created during the Vietnam War within the State Department as a way for people to not only let off steam about policies that they didn't agree with, but also to send their substantive criticisms all the way up to the Secretary of State. And that the State Department has a long history of valuing independent thought within the State Department. When you're a diplomat, when you speak publicly, you have to toe the line of the president. That makes perfect sense. But the flip side of that is that internally, there is a lot of robust debate because independent thinking is valued as fundamental to good policymaking. So the dissent channel, in short, has long been valued and protected, and people are generally not retaliated against for having supported a dissent cable. But the number of people dissenting in this cable is quite extraordinary. I'd recommend reading it. It's been leaked. It's out on the web. You can just Google it and find it. It's about 5 pages long, and it presents an argument against the executive order that's based not only in U.S. interest, but also on their interpretation of U.S. values. And so whether you support this executive order or not, it's an interesting read. It's an interesting read in part because the last third or so of the cable gives a list of about 5 different reforms or changes in procedure that could further strengthen our defenses when it comes to immigration without having to use this executive order. And so the dissent channel, this dissent cable is not just complaining. It is actually proposing alternative measures that, in the view of the signers, would be better for U.S. national security and more consistent with U.S. values than in their view the executive order is.
But just to clarify, so you're saying there's not been an unprecedented number of career State Department employees leaving the State Department?
Not yet. Some of those people were that were removed were career people that had been politically appointed then
That's right.
upward. And this is a classic example of the American bureaucratic inertia system, that career civil servants, who I think we all want, with neutral competence into the diplomatic realm, having some guidance on policy upward. At the same time, we have elections and we want presidents to have a mandate to do what they say they do in elections. And those things run headlong into each other, and both are in a sense protected. Presidents have what they call a mandate and say, you should do this because I'm the president. Obviously people who voted for the president and support presidents get very frustrated then with what they see as bureaucrats affecting what has seen to be voted. In turn, though, a lot of people are satisfied quite often being out of power when you have a neutrally competent set of professionals. These are people that have passed a civil service exam or have a degree typically in their area and are experts, and push back. And so I think we'll see this a little more forcefully than has been under recent presidents, happening quite a bit. Career civil servants are protected by whistleblower acts. These issues are recurring. We heard about this under the Obama administration. Executive orders on immigration or not executing them, whistleblowers and all this. We're going to see the same dynamics, but the politics are going to shift about who is thankful for having career civil servants there. And we'll see leaks appear quite frequently now on the New York Times and Washington Post, kind of denigrating the administration to some point. It leaves the internal American issue. Do we want elections to be sovereign, or do you want some neutrally competent experts to be a cushion against what could be seen as overreach by an executive?
Yeah, and I do think it's important to underscore that at the top layer of all these executive agencies are political appointees, and it is well within the president's right to replace these people. I mean, every president deserves to have people at the top of each agency who are his allies, et cetera. But what's really important is respecting the neutrality of the civil service below that as important sort of independently minded experts, at least internally independently minded. But he has every right to replace people at the top. I think there's some disappointment at how he's doing it. He's being very sort of overtly critical and sometimes in sort of personally nasty ways toward people who are political appointees with whom he doesn't agree. And I think that causes some concern. And we may see more people resigning, but it's important to underscore that these 1,000 people are current employees, and probably most of them are going to stay, but they want to register their dissent.
Mr. Lutz, you stated, actually I have a question and a comment. You stated Sisi, that he's a go-between between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Just a correction, since July of 2014, he's no longer speaking on behalf, or the Palestinians don't use him, period, in negotiation. Let me ask the question also. The question is, do you think the fact that Iran was included in the ban, does it have to do with the third country influence on the administration to include Iran because of our policies?
I think Iran was included because President Trump and many Republicans were very unhappy with the arrangement that President Obama made with Iran. They've argued against it. They have suggested that they would strengthen it, and I think that the inclusion of Iran in the list was a way of indicating, one way of indicating to Iran that not only do they talk about it, they mean it, and that it can expect more of the same. And it goes along with some more recent issues from Flynn in regards to Iran, and that they've been put on notice. They were already put on notice by the executive order. Iran doesn't fit with the other 6 countries, but it was a convenient way to send an entirely different message to Iran about what was going on.
The question is there is a third country such as Israel influence our decision? And
it is possible that Israel influenced the decision. Israel influenced the background on the decision. I don't think that Israel influenced it directly. I think that it goes to the campaign promises that were and the campaign issues that were raised by Trump, which reflect Israeli influence and in general. But I do not see the hidden hand of Israel behind the addition of Iran to the list. To answer that question, no. I think that it is part of the way in which Trump would have approached the issue anyhow.
Well, then if we're going to exclude Israel in that, so we got into the Gulf area because of Israel, bad intelligence or fake intelligence that they gave us in the 80s, and that's how we became involved in Iraq. That's why we have the refugees problem that we have now. That's why we have ISIS now. So doesn't it all fall hand in hand?
I did suggest that the situation in Israel provided a background. No, I'm not a big believer in conspiracy theories in that kind of direct influence, but Israel does, through its activities, influence the background of arguments, just as Britain or France or Germany influences the background of foreign policy arguments in the United States. So it is an important part of background arguments on the Middle East, and our relationship with Israel influences U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, as it has under President Obama and President Bush and President Clinton and his predecessors. Do I think that U.S. foreign policy is a direct reflection of Israeli interest? When they coincide, yes. When they do not coincide, no.
Most of the time they coincide, yeah?
Frequently, but not always.
Thank you.
I apologize. I cannot remember who had their hand first. So, and I know I saw your hand. I know there was someone all the way over there with his hand. So we'll go Esteban, and then you go ahead.
I have a comment to which I hope you can respond and provide your feedback. But you know, probably like many of you here, it's quite disheartening to wake up and to hear accidentally, toxic news sources from Fox News and even locally like Lolo spewing fear and hatred for immigrants and the other, right? So it's quite easy to feel powerless. I actually got rid of my Facebook because of seeing all this hatred of and support and love of hate from people that I care about. So I'm thinking, obviously we need to take action politically, locally, and do whatever we can. But in order to have a much more wide sweeping influence politically, I think we need to really focus on our conversations amongst our loved ones at dinner tables, as uncomfortable as it may be, and just to perpetuate this notion that if we're truly, let's just say that Trump and his flawed logic, let's just say he's correct that we're keeping ourselves safe from the others, the bad guys out there. So if that is your intent, keep us safe, what about the fact that males commit the majority of mass shootings? Should we fear males, right? Should we fear white males that commit school shootings? Are they the terrorists we should all fear and hide from or kick them out of our country? So this logic that, yes, there are some Muslims that are terrorists is just so flawed because there are Christians that are KKK members and there are white males that murder, right? So therefore, I think it's essential that we engage in these topics and these discussions with our ones that we care about, because it's just, you see these stupid memes that keep getting posted or erroneous facts or that they claim as facts, about what these terrorists are doing to our country when we have local terrorists that are being essentially ignored by those same people. So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, first of all, I agree that engagement with people you disagree on, that's what I research. And we have community members here that have open public engagement activities as part of what they do. And hopefully, you know, these kind of events that have a turnout of 75 people further that, right? And I mean, pushing and questioning is always good. When the Obama administration stopped executing through executive order what is part of the, whether you agree with it or not, I don't care who agrees with what, that was an executive order decision that clearly brought a backlash. The U.S. Congress sued the president. It's incredibly ironic to have one branch use another branch to sue the other branch instead of passing legislation, which they could have done, that to compel the president to do something. So we're not in new areas. This is kind of, unfortunately, from what Dr. Toole was saying, we probably have opened immigration over our history. That in the 1890s, for the court cases, supporting closure for other reasons, and there's a lot of latitudes courts give. We're going to find that out on this. But the community engagement, I think, has been pretty remarkable on all sides on this to engage one another, to see people in the streets, to see people in airports and everything else, whether one agrees with that or not. One thing is that in this election, there was a Pew poll, or somebody did a poll, that asked people whether they felt that they were threatened directly by terrorism. 75% or 76% of Republicans said they felt directly threatened by a terrorist attack. So in turn, Democrats, it was something lower in the low 20s that felt directly. And if you look around the map of where terrorists, where we would imagine maybe a terrorist threat would actually play out, I think you would imagine that would probably be in New York, LA, someplace where it's so these are real, these are real worldviews that people have that are driving this. And so I think your suggestion about engaging people, those are real emotions behind there, this kind of engagement is important.
And I would quickly add to that there are millions of people in this country who very much support this policy, very much support this executive order. And so, we live in a divided society right now, politically divided. And I think conversation with people with whom we disagree, you mentioned conversation with family members and friends, these are difficult conversations to have on both sides, right? We can be mutually unintelligible to one another, but it's vital to have these conversations. But one other thing your question asked was, what should opponents, or implied at least, what should opponents of this executive order or opponents of this president do? And and I would say that for Democrats, what's really essential is getting involved, because it's a matter of building up the party, building up political opposition over time, which means if running for office, if you've never thought of running for office, just joining local political organizations, getting active, whether it's about immigration or refugees or something else. Republicans have been very good about this, very good at this over the last several decades. Democrats haven't been. So if you happen not to support President Trump, that's the important next step, because what's really going to matter for people on the left is actually winning elections. And right now we're in a situation where Republicans dominate will soon dominate all branches of the federal government and have a very strong advantage at state government level around the country too.
I know you had a question. I'm sorry if I skipped someone. I was trying to remember where was the order. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to ask the panel why they thought we're discussing thousands of potential people in the United States and no one's talking about the millions of war refugees in the camps, desperately in need of humanitarian aid. They're starving in Yemen. Saw a video of it this morning. They're skeletal. And we're rallying to bring in a few thousand. And war refugees are a symptom. If you're interested in working on the disease, become a peace activist. We've been at it 15 years and need more people.
So the comment had to do with the question was, why are we focusing on why is this order, and why are we in this discussion focusing on a small thousands of people when millions of people are suffering in this way? The UNHCR, the UN High Commission for Refugees, reports that there are 60 million human beings right now in the world who are either refugees forced out of their own countries, or internally displaced people forced out of their homes and within their own countries. So the need is enormous, and the vast majority of those people who are outside of the people who are refugees who are outside of their home states are in neighboring states, which tend to be poor countries without the resources to handle them. Only a tiny percentage of the world's refugees are in the global north, in the United States or in Europe, and many fewer on a per capita basis are in the US than are in Europe. So yeah, if we really want to address this, the humanitarian situation and the suffering people feel, yes, we need to help support countries that have very big refugee camps in the global south and are supporting people who live outside refugee camps. In most places, refugees live outside them. And you also mentioned going after the root cause, which of course is trying to stop wars and other causes of displacement in the first place.
It's been lonely out there.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot. Yes, go ahead.
I think my question relates a lot to the reaction of a lot of current immigrants and visa holders in the U.S. You mentioned that this executive order may be a part of a more general attitude of the current president towards immigration. Do you see this as being followed by other policies that may restrict the granting of visas or allowing the entrance of immigrants from Muslim-majority countries or immigrants from countries that may have a history of illegal stay in the United States, such as Latin American countries?
Just in terms of what Jamie talked about in protectionism, you know, and if you notice the signs, even on Saturday, it was no wall, no ban. Even the people protesting saw connections, if you will, over this kind of notion of protectionism, sweeping not only the United States, but there's many Western democracies, you know, from France to Austria to the Netherlands, etc. So I think it's a broader idea that's kind of taking hold, and this is kind of part of that broader idea, globalism versus protectionism.
So to that point, when immigrants who are here say, oh, we have nothing to fear because that doesn't affect us immediately, well, there is something to fear.
Right. So, I mean, one of the surprising things about the executive order as it was originally constructed is it seemed to include green card holders, or didn't. Well, it wasn't clear. If you read the order, it was not clear. So originally, green card holders were being denied entry, and that was the very first thing I think that the administration reversed itself on. And now green card holders, people who are legal permanent residents, don't seem to be affected. But still, this is it's very much in flux. And of course, that has led a lot of people who are here on various kinds of visas, who are here legally, to worry about their situations. And I don't think we can have any clear answer on that. I think it's very hard to see what President Trump will do. He was not at all specific in the campaign about what his policies would be. And that, you know, and he's not been specific now about what his next policies will be, but no president is. I mean, you're not going to reveal all your cards up front. But it's certainly, yeah, he's certainly created the impression through his statements and attitudes that he is looking for bold policies that, yes, are sort of America first in his sense of protectionism, as opposed to open borders and globalization.
I would say, if I mention that Los Angeles case, that is the first definitive case at a court where one of the things the judge did is say, this executive order cannot cover green card holders. That is the first court case, because there's been still confusion about it, you know, at customs, at various airports. So that was, what, 2 days ago, I think I said.
One issue is that, you know, we have another branch of government that could be writing legislation. We've been screwing around for a decade and a half on writing a broader immigration policy to address people's concerns. And the political pressure, hopefully some of the groundswell from this and other executive actions that multiple presidents have now taken, but this has probably clearly brought the most reaction. That this will kind of compel some kind of movement toward having Congress really legislate and give some exactitude towards some things. That doesn't always work out. We can look at Dr. Toole's examples of past where Congress has been certainly able to restrict and be constrictive in ways that we probably wouldn't want to redo. But the Congress has blamed the president, used the court systems and politicized the court system to make hard kind of legislative decisions in lieu of Congress acting. And so maybe the political pressure people can place can move Congress forward on what should be the guiding principles of executive action.
Well, and part of it, when you have Congress using the courts, you had also different parties controlling different branches, and the dynamic, the political dynamic among the branches matters now. Now you've got the same party in control of two of the three. So how that affects it is interesting too.
I'll make this a last question so we can, and then we'll open it for more Q&A after we actually turn the TV off after that. Go ahead.
What about those who hold like student visas from those 7 countries, or their visas going to expire? Is it completely no more visas if they're already in the United States? Or has asylum stopped, those asylum cases?
Well, they're stopping processing.
Yes.
Well, and this was the big issue this weekend of people that were coming, that were stopped in the process. And that's what some of the stays, if I'm not mistaken, are about, because as the judge in Manhattan said, you know, if the government has already executed something, can you really stop that previous execution from happening? So that is a live question, but this is why universities and businesses are telling people from those countries not to leave.
But if they're undocumented here, there's no loophole to get them to stay if they can't go back to places like Libya or, you know, some of these places that have refugees.
Well, their status has already been probably in
jeopardy.
Yeah, in jeopardy.
Yeah, it's
they
in
might.
jeopardy.
We'll see. I mean, you know, our executive agencies didn't multiply the number of agents that are going to be due. So the one thing is that there's no the broad strike of suddenly turning and reaching out, because if anyone can increase the budget for something these days in this political climate to actually execute something, I'd like to see it. We've seen a lot of these agencies, and we just had a hiring ban with another executive order. So in effect, the ability to kind of carry out some of the worries that we have. Now they can tell people what to concentrate on. That's part of what executive branches does administratively. So that could be certainly the concentration, but you know, there's not going to be kind of an increased number probably of executive level people going after people that
like
are
ICE, etc.
Yeah.
It's one of the battles over sanctuary cities. Cities saying we don't want our police force to be, you know, the adjunct of ICE for purposes of rounding individuals up, etc., which is also a current battle going on.
All right, thank you very much to our panelists.